Hi, Dave. Welcome back. Thanks for coming back.
Great to see you again, Jason. Thank you.
So, Dave, last time you came to talk about some business fraud, and you even had a interesting story about a franchise and franchisee. But this time, we want to talk to you a little bit about estate fraud. So, what can you tell us about that?
Estate fraud, unfortunately, is very common because I think emotions are incredibly high, especially when someone passes away. So we frequently see cases where you and I are brothers, Jason, and I didn't like the way you treated me as a kid. I don't care what the will says. I don't care what the trust says. I'm going to lie to you about what the assets are. And if we're split 50-50, I'll just lie to you about how much is there and only split that smaller amount. So that is incredibly common. We see a lot of those cases. What we do is we'll go through the will, the trust, we'll start searching for assets, we'll track down everything that is supposed to be in the estate and then make sure it's split the way it was supposed to be. The most common things to watch out for that we see when you ask for an accounting, they refuse to give it. When you ask for any access to documents, they don't want to show them. Those are the more common, raise your eyebrows, something's not right here. Typically, it's also more of the I can't really tell you what Dad had. And you're like, I thought Dad told me he had $1 million. You say he only had 100,000. Something doesn't seem right here. If you can't iron things out and can't get information, that's when it's time to call us. But we have certainly had many cases where we've had the opposite happen, where someone's dad passed away, and it's a good thing. It's never a good thing when dad passes away or mom passes away, but someone passes away and we're not called on for fraud. We're called on to try to track down the assets because your parents didn't want to know. They didn't want anyone to know what they had. So now you're in charge and you don't even know where to start. So we can track down those assets for you. And we've actually been able to surprise some families in a huge way with a lot more money than they ever expected because dad or mom never let anybody know how much money they had. I mean, we had one family, the father was living in a shack. His pickup truck was almost 25 years old. It was all rotted, nasty. He ended up having $3 million for the family, and they had no idea.
Oh my
They
goodness!
thought he had nothing.
So,
So even though his house had to be bulldozed, it changed their lives.
was there a reason why did the dad just forget about it? Or was he motivated by other reasons to not tell his family?
Dad didn't want to share the money in case he needed it for the future. He was incredibly frugal and just didn't see the value of spending the money on the house or the truck, and then wasn't that well, so he wouldn't spend the money on traveling or going anywhere. So I guess he was really just always afraid he'd need it for the future. And that was it. So the kids never even knew. They thought they were going to be left with an old house with maybe no mortgage, but zero value. And then just value for the land, and then a truck that they couldn't auction if they wanted to. They'd have to just throw it away for scrap.
That's tremendous. So the father's just amassed this wealth before his kids realized it, or was he kind of doing it by the side, or how did he amass his wealth without anyone noticing?
He lived well below his means.
Ah,
And I think mom passed away fairly young. And so he just a blue collar guy that I don't know how much he made. If he made $60,000, he only lived on $40,000 and saved 20 grand a year and invested it well and just accumulated. So I'm guessing. I didn't know him as well. I guess there's other things that could have happened, but we didn't investigate exactly where the money came from.
well, it's probably a good thing sometimes. So, Dave, what about when they have assets that are international? Does that add a layer of complexity in terms of you trying to track down those assets?
It does add a layer of complexity, but we have certainly tracked down international assets before. I specifically remember one doctor we had who knew she was having a stroke, ended up having that stroke, called the hospitals, had her life saved, ended up in a nursing home, had no recollection of any of her assets. She was alone in this country and felt that she didn't have any assets. And we got involved with the attorney, ended up dealing with her home. Unfortunately, it turned out she was a hoarder. So her home, you couldn't find anything in. Everything had to be cleaned out and thrown away. And we were actually able to track down over $2.3 million in England, found her only living relative, a distant cousin, got the living relative to come and see her for the first time in 40 years. She died that night after seeing her cousin, and that person inherited all that money.
Oh wow, that's tremendous. So Dave, tell us a little about when should people be calling you? You know, what are the signs that probably should call you? There's probably some assets somewhere, because people are just thinking sometimes like, well, that's all dad has. Like, why should I call Dave?
Usually it's something that's going to trigger that something doesn't make sense. You know, well, things like partner theft, when you're sitting there going, it doesn't make sense that we make all this money, but then there isn't any. Things where you maybe dad's talked or mom's talked and you're like, I know that dad said he had $3 million and I know it was 4 years ago, but they could not have spent all that money. And now my brother or sister is saying, all there is 10 grand. Sorry, Jason, here's your $5,000 cut. Things that you just go, it doesn't make any sense. So usually whenever you raise your eyebrow and go, it doesn't make any sense, and even if you start investigating yourself and the person refuses to give you information, that's the time to call us. We can usually assess your case right up front. We can even guide you to go off on your own, but we can typically tell right up front, this isn't something you need us involved in. This isn't something big, or, oh no, you've got a major problem here. We probably want to get there and start taking a look.
Well, Dave, thanks for coming on today and educating us about estate fraud, essentially.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.